you, everyone. Thanks for taking the time tonight. I'm Dan Gallagher. As Pepe said, I am with Slalom. My background is really from product. I've spent over 3 decades in the product side of the house, but my focus since over 20 years has been the idea of, well, Agile is spectacular for continuous delivery, but how can you better continuously discover, continuously validate in sequence with continuous delivery? It's led me through, I came from industry, mostly healthcare and life sciences, and joined Slalom, became a consultant, joined Slalom almost 6 years ago now, where I've been really focused on building out a lot of the product offerings, including product mindset, in conjunction with their agile offerings. So this whole topic of productivity versus effectiveness really started to come together last December when Spotify, of all companies, announced its second layoff. I think this was a pretty big one, 17%. But what really blew my mind was what the CEO, Daniel X, press release about the layoff said. In it, he openly said that he was impressed by what they had been able to accomplish, but most of that was by adding more resources. By most metrics, and this is his words, not mine, we're more productive but less efficient. He also went on to say, today we have still too many people dedicated to supporting work or even doing work around work rather than contributing to opportunities with real impact. The reason this hit me so hard was not only the words that the CEO was very open and honest in a press release about a layoff, but the source, Spotify. I mean, most of you know, Spotify is one of the kind of anchor companies around Agile. They started in 2006. They became Agile soon after that, and it spawned a lot of Agile teachings and philosophies that came out of them. Hendrik Nyberg, we'll talk more about him, has driven a lot of ideas that behind Agile. So I started looking and thinking about the work that we had been doing at Slalom, which was really around how to make Agile more efficient and more effective. So it's not about productivity, it's about effectiveness. And it started to mesh a little bit with this idea. And it got me even more curious about Spotify. So I always loved this quote. What I love about this quote is that Peter Drucker said it in the 1970s. There's nothing so useless as doing efficiently that which should not be done at all, right? Just because we can do things faster, does it mean we're doing the right things? It doesn't. And there's a lot of...
Dan, are you sharing your screen?
Yes, you can't see it?
No, we cannot.
Oh.
Yep, it's coming.
Oh, okay. How's that?
Yep.
Okay. So
the Sabbath yet started in Revelation and Spotify.
Yes. So this is a snippet from that press release that I just pulled from, right? By most metrics, we're more productive but less efficient. And today we have too many people dedicated to supporting work or even doing work around work rather than contributing to opportunities with real impact. Those are pretty powerful words from a company that is really known for its agile chops. So I just mentioned this quote by Peter Drucker, which is pretty powerful as well, particularly because it's 50 years old, but as relevant today as ever. There are a lot of numbers out there around software's impact and effectiveness. These are some of them we've been able to pull, right? So 80% of software is seldom, rarely, or never used. 72% of products fail to meet commercial goals or fail entirely. 1/3 of technology investments in 2022 were wasted, which equals $250 billion. So you could punch holes in these numbers, probably, but I've always thought directionally they're accurate. I looked at a lot of the data, and you can see that they're directionally accurate. In my experience, I hate to say yes, I see the directionally accurate. You can see 60 to 80% of software released is seldom or never used. Why is that? And if you don't believe me, try this exercise. Take your phone out and count the number of screens you have that have icons, right? So once, if you swipe left in the screen, count 2, 3. Not even worry about groupings. But if you have 3 screens of icons, most people have 3 to 4. The average person uses 10 to 12 apps a month on their phone. So if you have 3 screens of icons, you have about 75 apps, not counting groupings. You're kind of in this range. About 20% of what you downloaded, installed, signed up for is being used on a regular basis. Why is that? That's what I want to get into a little bit today, right? So some of the things that came out of Spotify over the years that are directly relevant to Agile. Right? And a lot of these, I think all of these actually came from Hendrik Nyberg, who's no longer with them, but he's quite a well-known Agile pundit today. I know this one, build the right thing, build the thing right, build the thing fast, has been around for a while. I first saw it as a side note in a product owner demo, a product owner video he created, I think it was like 2013, over 10 years ago. The idea of outcomes, right? This one hits right back to the Drucker quote about doing efficiently that should be done at all. How do you actually deliver value as opposed to just more outputs? Probably his most famous one, he actually drew it out in the context of MVPs, but I think it's actually more valuable than that. We'll get into that in a minute. And then this whole idea of alignment and autonomy, which is kind of the Spotify model really hits on pretty hard. What occurred to me as I was going through this is I've been using a lot of these ideas, but I've found over the years that they're not enough. They're a good start, but they're not enough. So I'm going to talk a little bit more about breaking out of the productivity aspect of things and bringing in the level of effectiveness. How do you make get more value, more impact out of less things? So starting here with build the right thing, build the thing right, build the thing fast. If you listen to the talk track Nyberg has over this, he talks about seeking the balance, find that balance in the middle. And what I found interesting is I used to coach against that, right? We need to balance building the right thing versus building the thing right, building the thing fast. Over time, I started to realize that's actually not what you're trying to do. Balance means seeking equilibrium between two things, right? So that means to build things faster, you need to take away from building the thing right, or to build things faster, you need to take away from building the right thing. But if you're building faster, isn't that the opportunity to create more feedback loops so you can course correct? So maybe it's not about balance. Maybe it's about getting these things to work more in concert with each other, more in a synergistic cycle. So rethinking it a little bit. The thing, by the way, calling it build the thing is an output way of thinking. What we want to really think about is value. So deliver the value fast, deliver the right value, deliver the value right. When you look at it through that lens, deliver the value fast and deliver the value right is really continuous delivery, right? That's really what Agile focuses on. Most Agile transformations that are successful organizations now deliver more, right? Not necessarily the right things. To bring in that deliver the right value, you need to actually loop in continuous validation. The speed of Agile helps you cyclically deliver more faster. But what are you doing with it, right? If you're using it to validate that you are delivering the right things, then you're going to actually have the ability to course correct. Continuing around this, what we're turning this into is a cycle, right? So delivering the right value and delivering the value right is about continuous discovery, continuously learning. To make this cycle a little more, to take it out of software development for a minute, think about it this way. If a plane takes off from Boston, from Logan, with it's bound to LA, first thing it does when it takes off, first of all, before it takes off the ground, pilots know the intended outcome, safe arrival in LA, flight crew, FAA, grounds crew in both Boston and LAX, passengers, everyone who bought a ticket had a shared understanding of what success looked like, what the outcome was, safe arrival in LA at a certain time. When that plane took off, the first thing it did, 3 seconds into its flight, is it pinged LA and said, "Where are you?" Right? It didn't just leave it there and just hold its course for the next 5 hours, 6 hours, whatever it is. It waited 3 more seconds and pinged again and then adjusted. 3 seconds later, it pinged again and readjusted. It continually course corrected across the United States against LA. LA is the outcome. LA isn't moving. It's the anchor it's driving towards. But the plane is continuously course correcting because there's wind shear and elements outside of control. There's so many factors it cannot control. But what it can do is course correct against them, much like a sailboat adjusts based on the wind. It can't control the wind, it adjusts. That plane is off course 97% of the time. Think about that, 97%. Even though it almost always, my wife and I have 2 daughters who live in LA. We're on that flight a lot. It's almost always on time. It always achieves the outcome that we paid for, even though it was off course 97% of the time. This cycle is what that plane is doing. It's pinging, it's validating, it makes its adjustments, it delivers its course corrections, then it discovers again, validates around and around the circle. That's how you drive continuous value. Think of it as a cycle. It's not stealing one from the other. It's not building the thing right, slow down so you can build the right thing. It's a fluid cycle. And then that's one of the things that I noticed about Spotify is that idea that this needs to flow swimmingly. It needs to be flowing towards your common outcomes to be effective. To do that cycle, to understand it and to do it, you need to actually think differently. And I like to think about this from a shifting mindset. This image is a bunch of human neurons in the human brain. And what is interesting about this is if you look in that circle right there, you start to see, if you can see my mouse, there's a strand here of neurons. A new one connects and then disappears, and this one gets stronger. It'll recycle again so you can see it. There's a strong prevailing mindset right here down the bottom. A new one connects and isn't nurtured, snaps, and this mindset gets stronger. That's what's happening in our brains. We're constantly forming new mindsets, but we're usually pivoting off them because we pivot back to our prevailing mindsets. And when it comes to product and product development, right, we've got this prevailing mindset that tends to be feature focused. Velocity equals success. Requirements up front. This tends to create more reactive approach where IT tends to be more order takers to the business as opposed to true value-added partners, right? A lot of the prioritization happens by who yells the loudest. Roadmaps dictate what we did, even though they were drawn up a long time ago. We've learned a lot. The emphasis is on plan adherence. We develop a plan and we stick to it, right? You'll hear people say, just build it, we'll figure it out. And then my favorite hippo, which is highest paid person's opinion wins, right? So all of this is really centered around a need for certainty. And we'll get to the certainty piece in a minute. But these things together make up what we call that prevailing mindset. And what we do a lot of work on is attacking the ideas, the mindsets of product teams when we work with them, right? This isn't about ways of working. Ways of working is a key part of it, but to make ways of working sustainable and scalable, you need to change the way people think. Otherwise, it's too easy to drop back to that prevailing mindset. So you can't just shift people's mindsets instantly. You need to do it in a staged, a really thought through process. I've been lucky to be working with a couple of organizational psychologists for the past few years to help develop how do we actually shift mindsets to change the way people are working. So the way we do that is we understand the current state. We meet them where they are, which is usually big upfront annual planning events, focus on collecting requirements, very solution oriented, right? Let's figure out what the solution is, let's build it. They definitely adhere, our favorite, plan adherence versus flexibility, because flexibility is uncertainty, which I'll talk more about in a minute. That first shift is really about outcomes. We really drill into the fact that outcomes need to shape whatever it is they're building. What they're building is just an output. When we leave successfully transforming them, what they deliver is still an output. But that output is now shaped by the outcome it needs to enable. No one uses a product or whatever you're building. No one's going to use it because they want to use it. They're using it because they want the outcome it'll bring them. Very few teams are actually focused on that outcome. Very few teams are even aware what that outcome is. I'm going to talk a little more about outcomes now. But that's one of the things I noticed in kind of the teachings at Spotify, right? Yes, it's about the value, not the output. But how do you do it? That's very, very difficult. How do you make outcomes shape your outputs? By the way, there's a book, a good book actually, called Outcomes Over Outputs. If you're fans of Marty Kagan, a big product pundit, he talks about outcomes over outputs. I used to coach it that way, but something interesting I found, and I think I was working at Pepe when we figured this out, people, when you take outcomes over outputs, they think outputs are bad, right? Outcomes are great, outputs bad. There's no hierarchy here. They both coexist. We're not saying one's better than the other. We hear teams say, oh, I'm talking about output, that's wrong. It's like, no, outputs are what you deliver. It's why you have a job. When we leave here, you'll still be delivering outputs. Every decision you make, though, needs to be shaped through the outcome that output needs to deliver. That's what we're saying. So a product's value lies solely in the outcome it enables, right? Any product you use, look around your office, look around, any product you use, you're not using it because you want to use it. You're using it for an outcome. Someone once challenged me on that and said, well, I use my game because I like to use it with some game system. Like, yeah, but let's talk about why you use that. Use that so that, and what we get down to is that was this person's way to connect with others, right? That's what the outcome they're after. The game was the output that enabled the outcome. We're going to build on this because I think that when it's completely built, it's an important point, and it's probably one of the best, the one thing I would hope people take away from this. So the true value of an output or a product or service that you're building is solely its ability to generate that outcome. That outcome is a change in human behavior that creates a desirable, a measurable impact. Let me repeat that because there's a really good book that really gets into this. It's called Begin at the End by Matt Wallert. But what a product team is really doing when it's building something, or a technology team, what they're really doing is saying, hey, user, we have a better outcome for you. But to get that better outcome, we're going to do a release that's going to change your behavior. So you need to change your behavior to get the outcome. Sounds a little extreme, but think about it. Isn't that really what you're saying? Every time there's an upgrade to a product you use, you need to change it, maybe slightly, maybe more. Very few teams think about that aspect of it, but it's a really, really important thing. It's one of the reasons products fail. It's one of the reasons 60 to 80% of products fail. So just a little bit more on outcomes. I actually, I'm an alumni of Forrester, so I always liked their definition. What is an outcome, right? It's an achieved end state that can be verified through measurable results. It's going to be measured, right? It's tied to funded top-level initiative, right? It matters to the company. If it's an outcome no one cares about, it's really not a good thing to anchor to. It's defined through the lens of those ultimately accountable for the end state, right? So it may start out as an objective at senior level, but as it gets cascaded down to outcomes, the team needs to help a voice in that help the dialogue shape whatever the outcome becomes, because they have to deliver it. They need to understand it. They can't be handed an outcome and then expect to deliver it. They need to help shape it, not only in the planning stages, but during the development phases. It's colored by the interests of the related stakeholders. So stakeholders they don't have their hands in there manipulating it, but their interests are completely accounted for. And then my favorite, it's reached over time. It's not a point A to point B journey, right? Outcome, if you do, working on a client with outcome-based roadmaps. None of these outcomes on the roadmap happen in a quarter. They span multiple quarters, right? And my guess is once they get, the outcome is dropped from X% to Y%. Once they get to Y%, they're probably going to drop it more. By the way, if people have questions, please feel free to raise your hand. Pepe, I'm not sure I'll wait to see them if you would let me know. But I'm just going to keep plowing ahead. So some examples of outcomes, right? Child safety while traveling, right? Safe arrival of a child. What's the output? It's the car seat, right? If a young parent had another way of getting the kid safely to wherever they're going, that doesn't involve a car seat, then they do it. Car seat is the best option at this moment, right? More kind of industry focused ones, enabling data to be analyzed real time is an outcome. An output is an API that enables that, right? And this came out of a team where we were coaching a team, and we were like, all right, let's work on what the critical outcomes are. And they were like, we need to deliver 5 APIs. It's not an outcome, it's an output. What do these outcomes need? What do these APIs need to do? We're building this API so that, and once they understood that they were trying to enable data to be analyzed at real time, they were able to make much better decisions. The other one, lower hosting costs. That's an outcome. Move apps to the cloud. This is another one. We're coaching a team. Tried to get their outcomes framed up, and they said, well, our outcome is to move all these set of apps to the cloud. The business was in the room. They were completely non-involved. We asked why, and they said, well, they didn't know. The technology team did not know. The business chimed in and said, well, we're trying to save the hosting costs. I didn't say a word. I didn't have a chance to, because the tech team just said, well, wait a minute. If you want to lower hosting costs, and they came up with 6 other ways of lowering hosting costs in that meeting in 10 minutes that business had no awareness of. So the business partnering with IT is going to get its outcomes much better and cleaner, right? So we've kind of touched on these a little bit, especially in the Boston to LA example, but outcomes tend to be fixed, and you can anchor the team against them for scope. If it's done properly, if you understand your outcomes and you've actually gone through the process of cascading them, teams have a much better ability to tie their day-to-day activities to the overall outcome. It's much easier to align to outcomes than it is to outputs. So if you work with stakeholders, try to get them to agree on how important a feature is. It's impossible. Try the same conversation on an outcome, right? What outcome are we after? Let's find common ground there, and then help them realize that that's what they're really after. The feature is just a malleable deliverable that will get us there. Let's figure out how we have to make it malleable, how we have to change it, evolve it. And we'll get to that in a minute. So types of outcomes, right? There are outcomes of value creation. These are user outcomes. Because we have this product in the marketplace, it's creating value for the user. Because we're creating value for the user, we have ability to capture that value. These are the business outcomes. So think about these on a scale, right? The more value you create, the more you can capture. Most people don't think about it this way. As a matter of fact, when you think about some startups like, say, Facebook in the early days, they didn't have this scale even. They were heavy on the value creation side. They had no idea how they'd make money. Google, same way. Once they created so much value, they could iteratively figure out what's the best way for them to make money. And they figured it out. Outcomes of efficiency is really the fulcrum for this, right? How do you do things more efficiently? How do you better balance value creation and value capture? And we do I do a lot of product work. I do as much work in this area than the other two combined. So some examples, these would be the metrics that would measure these value creation. So higher user engagement, increased retention, higher customer loyalty, brand equity, advocacy. These are all lagging indicators that I'll talk more about that in a minute. On the value capture side, higher revenue, increased retention, increased acquisition, upsell opportunities, cross-sell opportunities. These are all ways that that capturing value would happen, the metrics that would drive capturing value. And really what outcomes of efficiency do is they help you do those two things better. Create value, capture value, and balance them. So a product think of a product, right? What is a product? This product is an item or service that is developed to enable a desired outcome for a target audience, right? The key to think about this, and I talked about this earlier, is that it's an outcome. It's the only reason users are using the product. One of the things I've been told a lot by leadership is I get things like, we just want to delight our customers, which always cracks me up because it's usually followed with, so we hire these really good UI people and they're really trying to simplify our UI. And I'm like, cool, that's great. But that's not the whole piece. So the only reason people are using the products for an outcome. So if they don't achieve the outcome, then there's no way you're going to delight them. You're going to lose them. So I kind of sketched this out for a CEO once, where it's like, all right, if you achieve the outcome, you either have success or delight. One or the other. If it's a complicated UI, they have to jump through hoops, but they get there, that's still considered success. If it's a simple UI and they get there, it's probably delight. But you can have a simple UI and focus on just that and not actually create the outcome. That's failure. Doesn't matter how nice and simple your UI is. The UI is an output. It's the output to enable the outcome, right? And then there's obviously the other way to think about it. I mentioned lagging indicators before when I had that scale sign up, and I wanted to just drill into that because when you're focused on outcomes, measurement changes. The way you think about measurement, it has to change. Outcomes are measured through lagging indicators. Outcomes, it's hard to instantly measure an outcome. It's usually measured over time, and you usually have to do some work to figure it out. Leading indicators measure outputs, right? Those are things like click-through rates, traffic. Those come quickly. Those are much easier because they're measuring an output. Depth of engagement, things like that. It's not that they're wrong or something bad about them. They're useful, but they don't tell you if you're enabling outcomes, and they're usually used to determine success. So think about it this way. If you have a product or a new product or initiative or whatever you're building, think about it sitting halfway through this, right? So you have, in the lagging indicator category, you have stuff already in the market. You have the current initiative. These are probably generating information that will help you understand your lagging indicators. Are you actually achieving outcomes? Where you're heading towards is leading indicators, MVPs, MVEs. MVEs is minimum viable experiments, which I'll talk more about in a minute. Prototypes, right? These are good, useful pieces of information, but they're not success. So when you think about it from this perspective, if you have a product, and I showed you this skateboard to car Hendrik Nyberg's thing at the beginning. I'm going to break it down in a few minutes. But think about it this way. If you have early versions of your product in the market, it's delivering you information. And over time, as you release more, those inform what you do next from your MVP. And the leading indicators will help show you, are you tracking towards new outcomes, the outcomes you're after, but they don't validate it. And a good example was I was working when I was in healthcare. We were building a product for doctors to use in the EHR system so that they're looking at a patient record as they type in symptoms and things like that, they would have the ability to see recommended actions based on what we're seeing, is clinical decision support information that will help them make better decisions based on the age of the person, presenting conditions, things like that. When we launched that, our leading indicators, because it was a new initiative, were telling us that doctors were using it, they were using it a lot, and they were engaged. When they were in it, they kept using it, and they came back and used it, a lot of loyalty. Most would say that's success. But we had gone through the rigor to say, what's the outcome we're after here? Our outcome was better clinical outcomes for patients. Patients were actually getting better. Institutions actually track that. So we're able to work with the institutions that were piloting this to say, all right, they could know every clinical interaction, where the app was used, and they could tell over time, it took months, were those encounters more successful? And they weren't. So even though the product looked successful, it wasn't. Now, over time, we're able to adapt and adjust the recommendations to actually create those better clinical outcomes. But that's the idea here, right? So as you move through, as you advance your product, you'll learn more. Your lagging indicators become more fruitful, and you can actually use those to inform, again, what do you do next? And your leading indicators will then help you understand, are we tracking towards the outcomes? But they're not success. A lot of people call leading indicators vanity metrics. They can, if you spin them right, they can make you look really good. But are they really telling you the information that people care about, which is outcomes? So some of the things we hear, when we feel organizations become more outcome centric, right? So when they used to say, what does the requirement say? It's what outcomes are we trying to enable? Things like we're all set, the requirements are already written, they're 18 months old. Questions start to appear like, why are we building this? How can we make it easier for patients? How else might we ... Even questions like I heard, after we were coaching teams. So what is our current customer's optimal outcome? That's a really great question for a developer on a team to ask. You ask that question a lot, and all of a sudden, everyone's thinking is going to start to change. Speaking of that, when I was in industry, I found that as a VP of product, I was actually going to sprint demos. Would pop into sprint planning. I was obviously at PI plannings, quarterly plannings. I started asking questions like, in quarterly planning, is everyone clear on what intended outcomes are for this increment? I wasn't asking what they're delivering. I wanted to make sure they had the outcomes, right? That subtle shift in my thinking over time created seismic impact, because all of a sudden the teams were starting to think about, things on the right alignment, shared expectations around everyone, clarity on what matters to the business, right? When I would pop up into sprint demos, I would ask the question, what did we set to learn this past sprint? And what evidence did we generate, right? Because usually going to sprint demos, like, hey, here's what we built, cool. Next, what's next? What did you, I don't want to see it yet. Tell me what you set out to learn, and tell me what evidence you generated to support that learning. This actually shifts the way they start to think about things, right? And it's this idea that you want to fail fast. You hear that a lot in Agile. I'm not sure, I don't really use that term, because failing means that we didn't succeed. If the team took a couple sprints to find out that an idea was really bad, is that failure? Failure would have been spending the entire program increment on it and then figuring out it was bad. I think that's success. And then questions to ask in sprint planning, based on what we just learned, based on the sprint demo meeting, what course corrections should be made, right? Based on that Boston to LA plane ping, what course corrections are we making to stay on course? It's powerful ways to think. As if you're a leader, even if you're not a leader, if you start asking these questions, you're going to see over time, you're going to start to see a shift in others. So we focus a lot on this outcomes shaping outputs, right? Once we understand that, that's the understanding LA. We're going to LA, aligning on that. There's also the journey to LA, and here's where Agile can shine. What we call is it's embrace uncertainty. So that is the continual course correcting journey towards the outcome that that plane made. And how do you do it, right? So I mentioned this earlier, I showed it earlier. This is Nyberg's drawing around MVPs, which I really, really like. I'm gonna get to that in a minute. The journey to outcomes is not about being right, it's about getting it right. When that plane took off and headed to LA, it didn't know the path it was taking. It knew the outcome it needed to create. So it figured the pathway out along the way based on all the factors that presented themselves through the journey. What if you look at Nyberg's talk track on this, it really makes sense, right? On the top row, user wants a car, right? So what do? You build a tire, you build the chassis, you build the rest of the car, and then you put a cap on it and deliver it. He's not happy until the end. He had no value. Why did he get no value? It's because it's not outcome focused, right? The outcome really isn't the user wants a car. The outcome is user needs to get from point A to point B. That's what the bottom one addresses. Skateboard, is it awesome? No. Is it what they wanted? No. Does it help them get to point A to point B? Yes. Same with the scooter, a little better, right? Wasn't working as good with the steering problems with the skateboard. Bang, we get steering mechanism. We're experimenting in between each one to see what we need to do next. That's an MVE. XMVP is the bicycle, right? Again, driving value towards the outcome, helping the user get there, and the team is learning. I'm going to get more into this in a second. So the journey to outcomes usually fails because, first of all, I said there's not an alignment on the outcome, number one. Number two, the route, the planned path is littered with assumptions that aren't validated. Assumptions are usually thought of, think about them in three sets: is desirability, viability, feasibility, right? Desirability, does the user want this? Will they use it? Viability, should they? And feasibility, can they? There are a lot of pundits out there who preach forth categories of usability, categories of efficacy, and those can be rolled up in here. I don't think there's any main right or wrong to it. To me, the most important thing is that teams are thinking and identifying what assumptions they're making, and then do the next step, which I'll get to in a second. So we talked about outcomes, right? A lot of the types of outcomes align to the types of assumptions. Desirability is around value creation. Value capture is around viability, and efficiency is around feasibility. I just wanted to draw that correlation. Here's an example. It's been anonymized, but this is a real client. They wanted us to come in and help them do a PI planning. They had this epic written. They had 2 teams, I think, for a quarter about to tear into it. By asking a few questions, we realized that there were 4 major assumptions in this one epic. 2 of them were completely invalid, and the other 2 weren't 100% valid either. So this would have been pretty much a wasted effort. We ended up validating in a couple sprints and course correcting. So they were successful. But all we did was ask a few questions through the lens of trying to identify assumptions. So let me give a real world example. I love this example. I wish I was part of this product. I was not. But the MRI machine, right? They had a big problem, huge problem. Children were terrified of them. They had to be sedated. They had to be strapped in. They're all things they tried to do. And there was basically a cry to say, all right, we need to redesign these machines and make them less claustrophobic and much more quiet. That would have taken decades, right? So let's think about the Nyberg piece through a slightly different lens. Let's think about on the left, value in learning value in learning, meaning that we're addressing the user's need and we're learning along the way over time across the bottom. So that first episode, that first example that Nyberg did, over time, there's nothing learned and there's no value delivered until the end, right? Pretty straightforward. That second piece, the skateboard to car, really starts to change things, right? Because you are learning each step of the way. And while you're incrementally driving more value as you learn. Now, I don't know if anyone noticed when it was drawn before, but the cars at the end are different, right? Little nuance that he put in there when he drew this to show that actually the team learned along the way and adapted and came up with a better product. Now, to bring the, what is this to do with an MRI? What really happened with the MRI was they started looking at what certain hospitals were doing that were started to help, right? So some hospitals were playing calm music and helped, not a lot, but it did help a little bit. So they started doing that. That's an MVP, right? It does add value, and they started to learn. Other hospitals started having the parent, a calming voice, talk to the children while they're in there. That helped too. They started merging the music and the calming voice. They started doing recordings of very calming voices telling stories. Then they started doing something really interesting. They started incorporating the noises of the machines into the storyline. And eventually, what they did is they redesigned the machines to support the adventure. So there was no redesigning. There was no technology here. This was a soundtrack and a can of paint. It ended up with a 90% patient satisfaction for it. This patient satisfaction score went up 90%. That's by thinking about things to the context of the outcome and then using an iterative journey towards that outcome. So we talked a few minutes ago about the true value of an output being in the desired outcome. I'm going to take that to the next level and say, therefore, a problem is something that prevents or hinders a desired outcome, right? You'll hear this a lot, right? Don't focus on the solution, focus on the problem. Completely agree. But it helps even more if you realize that a problem is merely an impediment to the outcome. Think about that, because that's actually a pretty big mindset shift. Because it keeps the outcome in the forefront of your mind. It's estimated that people make 15,000 decisions at work a day, 30,000 decisions in their life, right? In a day, usually. 15,000. I'm not sure if that's true, but even if they're half right, that's 7 or 8,000. If people are making that, if the developers and product people are making decisions based on the outcome, they're going to make better decisions. So it's hard to quantify how much valuable it is to think this way, but you can. I'll show you more later. So quickly on MVPs, right? The definition, I've read them all, multiple different flavors, but they basically say the same thing, right? What's the lowest amount of effort to the highest amount of value we can create? That's the way to think about an MVP. The problem is, and we've touched on this already, a value is an assumption, right? So we do coach a lot of teams through MVEs as well, right? And what the MVEs, the purpose of MVE is to validate the assumptions we're making around value. Right? So an MVE is low effort, high learning in the context of outcomes. So a series of MVEs will inform your MVP and make it more impactful. So start to think about assumptions. What we do with teams a lot is, this is just some examples. We run them through ways of thinking that start to identify what assumptions they're making. We do it to, we have a canvas for desirability, viability, and feasibility. Then we take and we break down those, we have them look at those assumptions they're making through this lens, right? How important is the assumption to be valid? That's the top half of this 2x2. How much evidence do we have? How much uncertainty are we carrying? High uncertainty means we need evidence. What you end up with is this upper right quadrant. What this quadrant is telling us is it's really important that these assumptions be valid and we lack evidence. This is where failure hides in plain sight. This is very common when we do this with teams, that this upper right is by far the most populated. The conversations that inspires is really powerful because then all of a sudden it changes the way they start to think about what's the next sprint all about. We need to validate some of these assumptions. We can't just blindly go ahead. We need to embrace the uncertainty. We then, once we identify what are the critical assumptions, we usually walk them through this idea of how do you take the assumption, let's refine it. Let's figure out what the intent of our MVP is. And then look at what evidence we need to generate, qualitatively and quantitatively. And all that goes into what they do for an MVP. So this is an anonymized version of actual one that a client did. They figured it out on a Miro board. So I'm going to pause for a second. Any questions or anything before we start to the next mindset shift?
So far, no questions on the chat.
Thanks. So aligned autonomy, right? So what's interesting about outcomes, the first mindset shift, it's almost like a fun little ancillary benefit that I didn't realize it until we started coaching it, that we started witness. Outcomes create alignment. If, like I said earlier, when you focus on outputs, you create more space for varying opinions, in opinions that are hard to validate. But if you take the conversation up with stakeholders and business folks around outcomes, even the technology teams, you start to see that they align much quicker. So focus on outcomes will start to create this natural gravity towards alignment. The journey that we just spoke of, the embrace uncertainty piece, what Agile allows is teams to work more autonomously. So it gets tricky though, right? Teams are working more autonomously, but we need to keep them aligned. And that was one of the images that Nyberg had drawn out, right? He is alignment low, high, autonomy low and high. So once we realized, we started, as we were shifting mindsets, we needed to actually bring in the culture of learning into it as well. So refining this over the years, we started to see that assessing environments, and I haven't actually coached an environment like the lower left, and that makes sense because most of them wouldn't even know enough to bring us in to do it, right? Low autonomy, low alignment, heavy micromanaging, the culture itself is indifferent. Pretty crappy place to work. This high autonomy, low alignment, a lot of startups, entrepreneurial environments tend to be like this, right? They may not have the best alignment, best overall vision, but they have teams very motivated and out cranking stuff out, but heading off in different directions. The high alignment, low autonomy tends to be more authoritative, conformist environments. People who just want to go to work, do their job, and go home at night. Mercenaries would thrive in this type of environment. The high alignment, high autonomy environments are really innovative, collaborative. You don't get mercenaries here, you get missionaries. You know, that was a Jeff Bezos quote. He said when he was when they were growing Amazon, he focused on missionaries, not mercenaries. And missionaries get behind your vision and understand your vision and become part of it. And they're motivated beyond money. It's an important way to think about it. So we already talked about the true value of an output is solely its ability to generate a desired outcome. Also, a problem is an impediment. It is something that hinders or prevents the outcome, right? It's an impediment. A problem is also not a single impediment. It's a series of impediments almost always. I've never not seen it that way. And the reason I think this is an important mindset shift is all of a sudden, if you view any problem you're trying to solve as a series of impediments to an outcome, this iterative journey we've been talking about in embrace uncertainty starts to reveal itself right in front of you. But the key is the outcome, right? You're not focused on delivering an output. You're focused on enabling an outcome. So the last shift that we go through, I won't get too different. It's really about how you sustain and scale this. Leadership, ways of working, operating models, and things like that. It's unless these ways of thinking are supported institutionally, culturally, by leadership, it's too easy to slide back to the old way of thinking. It's easy to slide back to that output-centric world. So that's really what sustaining and scaling is all about. And back to this mindset shift thing, I don't know if anyone noticed up in the upper corner here, it says 8 hours per second. I actually timed it. That new mindset shift that we talked about, that's here, it's connected for a total of 3 seconds, 24 hours, right? So that's why if you just kind of go in and coach a team for a day, it's not going to stick. It happens over time. It's really, really powerful if it's done over time in the context of their real work. And just to kind of give you an example, this is a financial services company we worked with. So I won't, but we're measuring mindset shift here. And I'm just zeroing in on the bottom pieces that are most relevant to what we just talked about. On the left, outcome focus. So the first column, each different color is a different team. First column is before we started. It's our baseline. 8 weeks later, they dropped in their ability to focus on outcomes. And after 8 more weeks of indirect coaching, they skyrocketed. So when I first saw this, I freaked out like we had failed. But then I realized, and working with the psychologist, is what happened was when we baselined them, they didn't understand what an outcome was. They thought they did. So what it showed was they were actually understanding at a new level. They were building a foundation for which this hockey stick could happen, this upward trajectory. The same with assumption awareness and iteration. And the same with psychological safety, which is really their comfort with failure. So my question to all of you is, what's your next step, right? I kind of threw a lot at you, probably unfairly, but the productivity that Agile can enable can be great, but it's the effectiveness, the ability to understand what outcomes you're trying to drive, understand that the journey to those outcomes is highly, highly iterative, and that you need to sustain that focus on the outcomes as you iterate, and walk away from stuff that's not right, that's not going to work. Pivot away from it early, not later. Use the power of Agile to do that, to build the right things at the pace of Agile. And with that, we'd be happy to stay around for some questions.
Well, it's awesome. Thank you, Dan. It does feel like a cognition overload, but
Yeah, it's a lot.
has quite a few nuggets in there.
Yeah. Just, my takeaway, focus on outcomes. The more you focus on outcomes, the rest will start to come to you.
Let's see. We have a quiet crowd, but Rama said, thank you. Love the analogy of the flight course correction.
Yeah, that believe it or not, came from Stephen Covey of 7 Habits of Highly Effective People I heard it a long time ago. But it was out of context of what I just used it for, but it fits perfectly. Right? The idea that your team can be off course 97% of the time, but still deliver the critical outcome your business needs is pretty powerful. But you can only do that if you're continuously iterating.
Let's see. Anybody else, folks?
Do you ever have a challenge when trying to bring this forward that someone says, but I asked for this, why are you talking about the outcome? Because they're asked for an output.
Yes, every time. That's why it's a critical part of coaching. We've really focused, particularly on the product managers and product owners, about how to have outcome-based conversations with stakeholders, right? But leadership has to be on board. We originally started doing this at the team level, and we had a lot of success within the team, but they completely collapsed outside of that. So yes, whatever, like for instance, whatever a stakeholder is asking for, whatever feature they want, I want this, I want that, they don't want it. They don't need it, I mean. What they need is the outcome they think they're going to get from that. But if 60 to 80% of software fails to create that outcome, there's a 60 to 80% chance they're not going to get it. So the idea here is to pivot them to think about outcomes. And I've said this to stakeholders before as a consultant. I said it as a consultant. Yeah, I understand you want that feature. You want it, you don't need it. What you need is the following outcome. And they'd agree with that and said, I don't know if that feature is going to get you that, but we're going to iteratively get to that outcome for you. And as long as they then understand that, but also this is key, you invite them to the sprint demo so they can see the iterative progress towards that outcome. And they can have this, they can shape it. They can have their input incrementally, but they'll start to see that aspects of what they wanted to build weren't going to work if the team's working properly.
So a couple of questions. Rick says, I like the outcome versus output. Think of what you want to achieve and brainstorm to the best way to get there. What's a comment?
Yep.
And then Yamini, outcome over output. I totally agree. Customer satisfaction is a good measurement of success, of successful outcome. Mm-hmm. But companies are expecting to measure success with tangible metrics during the journey to deliver outcomes despite having incremental demos. Any thoughts?
Yeah, I think that, I mean, leading indicators aren't bad, right? And sometimes they can be used to show trajectory, projecting towards success. You're driving towards success. But I think that's why I said earlier that leadership on board is important. Working with a client now where we just spent an entire workshop just on leading versus lagging indicators and why they're both important, but they should be more concerned with lagging indicators because those are going to validate that they're hitting what they're after, what their business outcomes are. So there's definitely a level of education that needs to take place.
2 comments and a question. Outcomes create alignment. Love that talk. Himanshu says, fantastic talk. Going to require a lot of processing to apply this. The slide about mindset shift was interesting. Could you elaborate on that experiment and measures?
I think that's probably the
neurons, maybe?
The trajectory, yes, the slides. So what we did, when we showed the financial services client, what we did, I was a kind of I had a lot of input, but I did not run it. It was run by organizational psychologists I work with. We did a survey, a baselining survey that was pretty complex about the way it looked at heuristically all the different aspects we were trying to test. We did the same one at a midpoint, and then we did it at the end. And it really started to show analytically the shift that we were witnessing. And that was the key thing, is that was just the data. we witnessed significant behavior changes, and the leadership who hired us reported significant changes as well, anecdotal changes. So it was done as a survey that was really tested their understanding of outcomes, their current workload with outcomes. And that was just one example, outcomes. There was iterations and experimentation, a lot of other aspects. It was pretty complicated.
See?
Are there any, are there any exercises that can be used to show the participants' value of using outcomes versus outputs? Participants. Participants would probably be the team members, I'm thinking.
Yes.
Okay. So what we have not been able to get to the point that we would love to, because the true impact of this on like bottom line, increased revenue, things like that, takes years, and most companies won't be able to measure it because we don't work with all their teams. We just work with small segments of them. So we don't have hard data to say, okay, when teams applied this mindset shift, the products they worked on were X amount more revenue or anything like that. We have a lot of anecdotal evidence from the teams themselves and from their leadership that they're much more effective. They might not always be driving more productivity, but what they are delivering is more spot on. I'm just looking at the options for training leaders on focus on outcomes and outputs. I think we do that. I do that a lot. I think that the problem historically has been that it's done in a workshop, right? It has to be done over time. It has to be done in context with their actual workday, right? When their workday, they're the real problems they're dealing with on a daily basis. That's the key piece. So it's done. It needs to be done over time with outcomes over outputs. We like to start with their overall objectives and help develop cascading OKRs all the way down to the critical outcomes. They generate them. We coach them through it. But that's the only way. It's very difficult for leaders to really adapt this as well, because let's face it, we're all successful in our careers usually because we've delivered stuff on time within budget, right? Very rarely have we been held accountable for the outcomes those eventually create. So it's really, again, the mindset shift is key. To start thinking, you know what, delivering something on time and budget isn't enough anymore. We need to actually enable an outcome that's going to move our business forward. Book recommendation for leading indicators. I think I would read Measure What Matters by John Doerr. It's not necessarily about leading indicators, it's about OKRs, but I would call it the Bible of OKRs. And the other one is Outcomes Over Outputs by Josh Seaton, which I agree with about 51% of it. But it's still a good read.
I don't know, you saw this, Dan. What are some good options for training leaders on how to focus on outcomes versus output?
I think I just addressed that one, but yeah, they have to want to do it. The way we do it, we train them over time, right? I think that I know sometimes there'll be a workshop on it. We found it has to be done over time in context. Usually, starting with what we like to do, start with the overall objectives and work down creating cascading OKRs for the organization all the way down to the team level. That's the powerful way for them to do it, understand it. We mix in understanding of leading and lagging indicators and things like that. But it's not an easy process. It's not easy to do. They have to be willing to do it. And that's the biggest factor. We're working with a client right now that's very, very willing, and it's great. We've worked with others in the past that felt like they were checking a box. It didn't go well.
Any others? That's a good crowd. Good questions.
Yeah, great questions. Thank you guys very much for your attention and the great questions.
Well, it looks like everybody's still processing.
Well, you can message me on LinkedIn if you have questions. I talk about this stuff all the time. Thank you, Ed.